The big industrial revolution overview. The industrial revolution is going to be the main revolution that we'll be studying in the course. Even though other revolutions such as the American Revolution or French Revolution will be mentioned, the main focus will be on the Industrial Revolution because of the importance that it continues to still have on our day-to-day lives. And due to the size of this topic, we're going to be looking at both the first and second industrial revolution. And so the audio notes have been broken up into part one being the first revolution and then part two being the second industrial revolution with its own audio notes recordings. So what is and was the true historical significance of the industrial revolution? And to think about it, you want to go back to the times of the ancient Greeks or Romans would have been comfortable living in Europe in 1700s because the daily lives had not changed all that much. The daily lives, especially on the agriculture, so the farming and technology, had not really changed in over 2,000 years, going all the way back to the ancient Greeks or the ancient Romans. However, the Industrial Revolution changed human life drastically, and more had changed over the last 250 years than what had changed over the last 2,500 years. That is the true historical significance of the Industrial Revolution. So what was the Industrial Revolution? The Industrial Revolution was a fundamental change in the way that goods were produced. Change because goods would be produced by machines rather than human labor. And by going to machinery, it became more effective for the means of production, and that would create subsequent higher levels of production, which will have far-reaching changes into societies, as one by one societies would industrialize to gain more wealth, power, and prestige. The Industrial Revolution had machines replacing human labor. And because of that, there was new sources of energy that were developed. Energy such as water, steam, electricity, or even oil with sources such as kerosene and gas would be discovered and invented. And some historians would argue that advancements today in atomic, solar, or wind also had its origins in the Industrial Revolution. And that's because of the substantial increase in the use of metals and minerals such as aluminum, coal, copper, and iron. As you can see in this image, early on, and really before the revolution, mining was simple, cheap, shallow, and not exactly safe. But into later on in the revolution, you see in this infographic, there was a substantial change in how the mining was done. There's a far bigger operation with shafts, slopes, levels, buildings, and other kind of layers upon layers for it, all getting up the minerals and materials needed to create the metal-made goods. But also, children laborers were very commonly used because children were small, they're cheap, and can be more easily intimidated compared to adults. And this would make the cost cheaper. But as you see in this image, the miner's life was definitely a hard life. While it was a stable job and sometimes was decent pay, it was dangerous, dingy, dark, lonely, with long, long hours down below the crust, digging away. The Industrial Revolution saw some big changes in both transportation and in communications. For transportation, changes came from before the revolution, Europeans used wooden ships. As the revolution progressed, wooden ships were replaced by iron ships, which then were replaced by steel ships, essentially wood-powered, steam-powered boilers. Also, new types of transportation, such as trains and cars, were invented, with communications also having saw some substantial advancements in inventions such as telegraph, telephone, and radio. All these types are being used today, though obviously the design is different today, but the idea still remains. This is when these common components in our lives were invented or enhanced. And with the developments, there was a mass production of goods, an increased number of more goods. There was increased diversity of goods that were being produced. And that's because of the factory system. And more people in the rural to urban migration, meaning people were leaving the countryside and were moving into the cities. There was a development of capitalism, more money to be used for industrial growth. You have new social economic class, such as the working class, the bourgeoisie, and the wealthy elite. There was an enhanced commitment to research and development, researching into new technologies for it. It's always inventing and making new. What helped prompt this was how the Europeans, especially Western Europeans, were building their empires. England, France, the Dutch, the Spanish, and Portuguese all had overseas empires. And these overseas empires could supply raw materials. And these raw materials would then be manufactured into a good in Europe. It also increased the wealth and prestige of the Western European countries, because before then, the route would go east, the old Silk Road, but that would come to an end, the Silk Road, once the city of Constantinople had fallen. So if the Europeans couldn't go east, they would go west to get to the riches of India and China. One thing to know about the first Industrial Revolution is that it was not one singular revolution. In fact, it was actually several smaller revolutions that were taking place either before or after the revolution began. One I particularly focus on is the Commercial Revolution, a revolution that happened in 15th, 16th, and 17th centuries. And during the commercial revolutions, Europeans were expanding their power worldwide, the empires that they were establishing in North America, South America, Africa, and even in parts of Asia. As their knowledge of geography, global geography, was increasing, you also had increased amount of trade and commerce. And because of that, the guild system could not meet the growing demands of the goods that were being requested. This will establish the driving force of wanting to get more wealth and power with prestige. The idea of the church being the center was being challenged. The idea that the earth was flat was also being challenged as the Europeans' overall global worldview was changing. Another revolution that took place was the scientific revolution in the 17th or 18th century. Being led by discoveries by Boyle, Lavoisier, and Newton, it was an intellectual revolution as well, from Voltaire and Locke, with the whole Enlightenment, the French Enlightenment, the Scottish Enlightenment. There was a feeling of discovery and intellectual inquiry. The Europeans were gaining more and more knowledge of the world. It weakened and removed the idea of superstitions and the traditions of the church, while encouraging research and new and better ways to go about life. With those kind of revolutions began changes in the domestic system. Now, the domestic system was first developed in England around 1600s to 1800s. Essentially, the domestic system was your local shop. The domestic system was a system of production of putting out items when ordered. Business people will arrive to deliver the raw materials to workers. Workers will then manufacture these raw materials into their homes, and their goods, usually at their homes. And then the business people will pick these finished goods up, pay the workers their wages for the amount of items, and then leave. It's more personalized. Orders are made on demand there, but it was not meant to be on volume. It was never meant to be on volume. The factory system, however, was designed to be on volume, and the factory system replaced the domestic system. It was a faster means of production. Workers can be concentrated in a set location, and unlike the domestic system that met the demand when needed, the factory system worked on the anticipated demand of the item rather than what the actual demand currently was set at. As you can see in the background too, the factory system will also have some pretty deep changes to society, especially when it came to wealth and the value of the individual. The cities of like Manchester became like the real armpit of the British Empire. That was where the mines, the factories, the smelters, like this, Manchester being in central northern England there, also the Lake District, this is the might of the British Empire because the British or the English were the first peoples to actually begin industrializing. Now you see on this source, you may want to pause so you can take a moment to look over what the differences are between the domestic system and the factory system. It is important that you really understand the method, the location, the type of tools, the output, the work, and the type of work that was done between the domestic system and the factory system. But as I mentioned too, England was the birthplace for the Industrial Revolution. England was the first place to industrialize there. However, there is no set concrete date for when the revolution began. And more to the fact, it was a gradual, slow set of changes that began with those earlier revolutions that was previously mentioned. But that being said, around 1750 was when it started to become noticeable of the changes that were occurring in England. But there is still no set date. Unlike the French Revolution that had like the official date of the revolution being the storming of the Bastille, this one doesn't. Now, the reason why England was the first country to industrialize, it's not one reason, it is in fact actually 6 reasons why England was the first to industrialize. In the next several slides will explain it, but essentially it comes down to money, colonies, raw materials, workers, ships, and geography. That is why England was the first to industrialize before any other nation. When it comes to money, England's resources was in the wealth. Because of the commercial revolution, there was many English merchants, or traders, that were very, very wealthy because of the commercial revolution and the changes that revolution brought to the overall psyche. And because of these merchants had the capital, so money, to invest on factories, money to buy buildings, money to buy machines, money to buy more and more raw materials, and also money to continue inventing and discovering new ideas. Money, money, money. The second reason is, of course, the trade system, or the colonies. But the trade system was called the triangular trade. The triangular trade, also known as the North Atlantic trade, was essentially broken or set up into 3 parts. You may want to pause this for a moment to really explore the triangular trade, but essentially and generally, slaves will be brought from Africa over to Central or North America. From the Americas, raw materials like silk, rice, sugar, molasses, fur, lumber, tobacco, raw materials would be brought over back to England, being the mother country of the empire, and those raw materials would be manufactured into some sort of into a good, and those manufactured goods would be sold again back into the colony. It is a three-part triangular system. And the more you invent, the more people, the more resources. It's the Cookie Monster. You just keep on adding more and more and more to it. The wealth from the commercial revolution spread beyond the merchant class. England had more colonies than any other nation, especially after the 7 Years' War. The colonies gave England access to enormous amounts of markets with vast amounts of raw materials, and colonies had rich textiles for the centuries, and many of the natural cloths popular today, such as calico or gingham, are originally from India. But China also had a silk industry as well. An image of also the rivalry between the English and the Dutch as a result of the commercial revolution and their companies. Another advantage England had was its raw materials. England had vast quantities of coal, vast quantities of iron there. Coal was the power used to power the steam engines. Iron would be used to create as a building blocks for large machines, railway tracks, trains, and ships. Having vast quantities of these raw materials also gave England a very substantial advantage over the other powers. The amount of coal that England had is equivalent to modern day the amount of oil that Saudi Arabia has. It was considerable, which gave them that advantage. Another reason why they industrialized first was the workers. Serfdom and guilt ended earlier in England than any other country. People once were able to travel freely around the countryside could no longer do that because of a new law that was passed by the government. The law was called the Enclosures Act, and these Enclosures Act caused many small farmers to lose their lands, lose their original livelihood. So if they can't stay on the land to work, they will move to the cities to find work, which means more and more cheap workers into the factories could be used. The Enclosure Acts. Also, England had the world's biggest merchant fleet, ships. But these are not warships, these are ships of trade. And because of the commercial revolution, England had built up a sizable fleet of ships to selling goods, the triangular trade, whether it's the raw materials, manufactured goods, or even the slave trade. But the vast numbers of ships could bring raw materials and finished goods to and from England, colonies and possessions, as well as to other markets. It's more and more and more. If you like histories, you may want to do a Googling about the Cutty Sark, infamous and fascinating but controversial ship from the commercial revolution. And then the sixth and final reason why advantage was the geography. England was the political center of Great Britain, and Great Britain is the island, right? England, Wales, Scotland, and Ireland. Great Britain as an entire island began in 1707, and it did not suffer any long-lasting fighting on its land during all the type of wars in the 18th or even 19th century, even with the Napoleonic Wars there. So it kept the homeland, the British Isles, safe from conflict and from damage. While Britain did participate in many wars, but those battles were not on British soil. Also, the island had excellent harbors and ports. The damp climate, because it does rain quite a bit, helped out the textile factories and the textile industry because the thread from the cotton fields would not dry out. Plus, with the geography, Britain finally now had a stable government, and there was no internal trade barriers. They were the island that was ready to have changes. One of the best quotes to think about this time period is, "The necessity is the mother of invention." As an example would be creating a spinning machine. We need to speed up with threading of thread, so a power loom was created. You need to have it, you need more cotton, so the cotton gin was created. You need stronger iron, a new steel melting process called the Bessemer process was invented. Essentially, the necessity is the mother of invention is the process of inventing never ends. One invention will always inevitably lead to another, to another, and to another, to another. As more steam power machines are built, factories need more coal to create this steam, which results in mining methods being improved to get more coal. The whole first revolution, the first industrial revolution, is referred to as the triumph of steam power. And society getting used to the process that inventing would never stop. You're always inventing. You're always wanting to make something new. You always are pushing, pushing, and pushing further and further along there. It's kind of like today. Apple releases a new iPhone every year. Do they need to release one? No. But they are always inventing because they want to sell. They want to keep on pushing that boundary. The necessity is the mother of invention. You have to keep on inventing, making changes so you can remain competitive and continue to sell your goods there. And because of that, the textile industry was the first industry to industrialize in the first industrial revolution. Textile is essentially clothing or fabrics. And Great Britain had learned a lot about how to make textiles from the colonies and territories that they had in India and in China. And in particular, they learned lots about cotton, because cotton is that raw material needed for textiles. Um, but unfortunately, because of that triangular trade or the North Atlantic trade, there was a considerable number of slaves that were brought from North Africa over to nowadays United States, the southern United States. These slaves would work on the cotton fields, picking the cotton for the textile factory, the textile industry, as it just needed more and more and more materials because it was the first to industrialize. As you see on this map, the growth of slave trade in the United States had substantially increased from 1790 up to 1860 there, and it also gives you a little bit of insight too about certain power divisions even in the United States today. Though by 1860, the United States definitely was its own independent country. The United States was no longer the 13 colonies of Great Britain. They've had their Declaration of Independence, the second declaration with the War of 1812, even to the Civil War soon not long after. The United States was its own sovereign country, but it was still providing the cotton to the textile factories in England there for the whole revolution. See with this kind of image too, this shows how the typical workers' lives are like in this. But what I find noteworthy is really there is no concerns when it comes to safety. No ceiling fans, the windows are closed, there's no guardrails, no barriers, we are soft and squishy compared to the machinery, the gears, the threads, all that process of weaving the items together. But that's an example of what an early textile factory would look like. With the growth and birth of the textile industry, you have John Kay, who invented the flying shuttle, James Hargreaves, who invented the spinning jenny, Richard Arkwright, the water frame. It's always inventing. Spinning jenny kind of looks like our sewing machines today. The water wheel would be the early form and help to establish the creation of factories. The textile, Samuel Crompton, the spinning mule, Edward Cartwright, the power loom, Eli Whitney, the cotton gin, Elias Howe, the sewing machine, But it was not just English people who were making inventions. Sometimes you also now have Americans for it. But as I said, the Industrial Revolution, the first revolution, was a triumph of steam power. Early water power involved mills being built over fast-flowing streams and rivers. But early water had problems with not enough water to meet the demand. Rivers can flood, dry up for it. But the actual invention of steam power had been something that humans have tried to figure for a long, long time, even going back to the ancient Egyptians for it, trying to figure out how to create and discover the secret to steam power. But with steam engines by the 1800s, steam engines were replacing water wheels as the main source of power for the factories. With steam engines, factories can be relocated nearer to raw materials, cities and ports. Cities themselves will grow around the factories, cities like Manchester and Liverpool. With coal and cotton or iron, there was vast amounts of fuel that was required to melt the iron to burn out the impurities. But Aaron Darby discovered how to heat coal to burn off the inefficiencies. John Smeaton invented the whole smelting process. Henry Cort developed the puddling process, which purified and strengthened the molten iron there. This would have vast differences or changes because the amount of coal that was produced, the amount of pig iron was produced. Britain by the 1800s was producing so much coal and iron that you can combine everyone else in the world, and Britain will still have more than everyone else combined. It was, once again, coal and iron, the role of these raw materials and the geography. It really starts to be like this cascading snowball effect for the advantages, which would be the whole part of the Bessemer process in steel. Before the Industrial Revolution, steel was difficult and expensive, but Bessemer figured out the process, how to make it cheaper, how to make it faster, which really brought the whole age of steel there. And steel would become the most important metal to be used in the last 150 plus years, and various other metals were used to type this type of steel. And from steel would have these substantial changes in transportation. Before the revolution, canals or barges were pulled by mules, ships were using sails, you have horse-drawn wagons. But after the revolution, the Bessemer process and steel and such, trains and steamships, trolleys and cars are all part of the modern day kind of transportation. Robert Fulton, the steamboat, Thomas Telford, the macadam roads, George Stephenson, the locomotive, Gottlieb Daimler, the gasoline engine, Rudolf Diesel, the fuel type, the Wright brothers of the airplane. These are all inventions of transportation during the Revolution, like the Erie Canal in North America, where waterways are slow, light, and costly, but canals are faster, they're cheaper, they can transport heavier goods, and they can go in different directions as well. Steamboats was another really interesting and important invention that was made during the First Revolution. Robert Fulton invented the steamboat actually in 1807, an American. The Clermont operated the first regular steamboat route running from Albany and New York City. In 1819, the Savannah used a steam engine as auxiliary power for the first time when it sailed across the Atlantic Ocean. In 1836, John Ericsson invented a screw propeller to replace paddle wheels, and in 1838, the Great Western first ship set sail across the Atlantic on steam power alone, which took the voyage only 15 days. By sailing boats, usually the voyage across the Atlantic would take around 2 or 3 months to complete. The point is, even though England was the first country to industrialize, America, by the end of the 1800s, had the most highest level of industrialization out of any country. Here's an example of what a steam-paddled ship would look like. Even in British Columbia history, the Beaver was very similar to this design. The macadam roads were strong, hard roads that were invented by Thomas Telford and John Macadam. They would pour dirt and gravel, but it was an improvement. The macadam roads had smooth, hard surface that supported heavy loads without requiring a thick rock bed. Modern roads that we use today are similar versions to the macadam roads because of the use of tar to limit the amount of dust from the travel. But macadam roads would take all national roads and improve them. It was a source of good capital. It moved goods for it. In this kind of image, you will see how the roads were done and just how important an improved style of roads really was for overall economy, nation building, economics, law and order, business opportunities. But despite the use of canals or macadam roads, it really was the railways that had the true symbolism of the triumph of steam power, which was the first revolution. In 1830, Stephen's rocket, the rocket was the name of the very first train, traveled 40 miles between Liverpool and Manchester. By the rocket, it took only 1.5 hours to complete. Normally, by horseback, it took a much longer period of time. Between 1830 to 1870, in the UK, they had 49 miles, so about 75 kilometers, to over 15,000 miles of railway tracks across the UK. And as things improved, steel rails were then replaced by iron rails. In 1869, Westinghouse air brakes made trains safer, which would lead to more comfort, heavier trains, more cars, more railway beds, even sleeping cars as well. Trains change everything, and put into a big picture context, today we know just how incredibly important trains are to society for transporting goods and people alone. The very first train, the rocket. And even though, as we said, England was the first to industrialize, there was railways in the UK, the United States, the new colony, as I said before, no longer the 13 colonies, will use railways, pardon my pun, to build their country and to establish American law and order across the land. And all these red lines on the map indicate train lines across the eastern and a little bit into the central territory of continental United States. And railways would be a tremendous source of capital, meaning money. So the commercial revolution brought a lot of money to Great Britain, especially the English, but railway brought a lot of money for the United States. It also promoted the American government and promoted rapid growth and really established that whole westward expansion and the colonizer and the settlers, along with all the improvements in communications. Samuel Morse with the telegraph, Alexander Graham Bell, the telephone, Cyrus Field, the Atlantic cable, Giuliano Marconi, a wireless telegraph, Lee de Forest, a radio tube, and Vladimir Sorokin with the television. All these are still part of our lives together. These are part of the communications revolutions. First industrial revolution, the triumph of steam power, but still had lots of smaller revolutions mixed in throughout the way. And why we ultimately will look at the first revolution, the industrial revolution, because of the use in our lives today. And the last of the smaller revolutions in the first was the printing revolution. Printing revolution from 1800 to 1830, they went to using an iron printing press, a steam power, rotaries, printing pages on both sides, the linotype machine. Essentially, the printing revolution would lead to newspapers, journalism, investigative reporters, the news. So the Gutenberg press started to mass produce printing materials, but the printing revolution produced mass production of news. keeping people informed and accountability there, because newspapers would be a lot cheaper, and if the newspapers are a lot cheaper, then it will have more newspapers. Pax Britannia, the British rule the seas, and the newspapers will continue to tell about all the stories of triumphs and tribulations. You may